A warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sophie Lambin, and I'm the editor partner for the Women's Forum for the Economy and Society. At the Women's Forum, we believe that women's voices and vision are crucial to building a more inclusive economy and society. So, in collaboration with the New York Times, we are delighted to be hosting a series of live conversations with women leaders. These conversations also reflect our desire to take aim at injustice and inequality, something that is critically needed, as the events unfolding in the US clearly demonstrate. Our speakers to date have included Fumzile and Lambo Nguka from the UN Women and Rachel Kite, Dean of the Fletcher School of Tufts at Tufts University. We have a few more series coming in the next few weeks. These are women from around the world, women on the front lines, and women leading us through the crisis and through the recovery. Today, we'll hear from one of these women, who not only was instrumental to the Paris Agreement in 2019, but also led climate action during her country's G7's presidency. Our guest today will discuss how governments can design sustainability into an inclusive recovery. To lead that conversation, I'm very pleased to welcome Katherine Porter, Toronto bureau chief from the New York Times, who has lived and worked all around the world, but joins us today from her cabin in Northern Ontario. Katherine will lead our discussion today with a fantastic guest. Katherine Porter, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me here, and thank you all for joining us. Sophie's right. I am talking to you from a little wooden cabin on the edge of Georgian Bay, which is part of Lake Huron. It's one of the Great Lakes in Canada. And please excuse me if there's noise from outside, because I have some children who have become quite wild after more than 2 months with no school. It is my great pleasure to introduce Catherine McKenna. She's Canada's Minister of Infrastructures and Communities. If you are Canadian, you would have known her name over the past 5 years. She is the face of action in Canada on climate change. She was the first minister in a newly renamed Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change. She's a lawyer who practiced competition and international trade law in Canada and Indonesia, and was a senior negotiator with the United Nations peacekeeping mission in East Timor. She's also a former competitive athlete, a great swimmer who still runs marathons and paddles and bikes if you follow her Facebook and Twitter feed. And she is a mother. In fact, if you read her Twitter bio, the first thing it says is mom. When I first interviewed her in 2015, when she was just about to take up her new job, she made a vow to have dinner with her children every night that she could, and work afterwards, and to try and find some kind of work-life balance as mom of 3 young children and a minister of a huge and very important ministry. I can't think of a better person for us to be talking to here in Canada about the topics of green and inclusive economic recovery from this terrible pandemic. So thank you very much for joining us, Minister McKenna. And I wanted to just ask, I began by talking about where I am talking to you from and the chaos that is happening around me. I'm wondering, what has the last 3 months been like for you, and what personal insights have you had trying to balance being a woman in such a high-powered, important job at a time of such crisis for the world and Canada, but also, as someone who, as you say, is a mom first of 3 children?
Wow, well, that's a really big question. Thank you very much, Sophie. I'm delighted to be here. And Catherine, I kind of wish I was at your cabin because I have nowhere to swim. I bought a little pool with a tether, and that's how I get my swimming in. So look, I think first of all, my number one reflection is that my title is Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. And I think we've all realized how important communities are. And I didn't really understand what that meant in terms of my title, but now everything is local. We recognize the importance of our local businesses. We recognize the importance of our essential workers, many of whom we wouldn't really have noticed because we pass them every day, whether they're working at our grocery store or helping serve people in long-term care facilities. Nature, that people are recognizing the importance of being able to get out in nature and being innovative with their natural spaces. So I've suddenly realized that infrastructure is a really bureaucratic word, but communities is not. And now I see my portfolio in a really different way. It's really about how do we improve communities and how do we improve lives. And there's a really smart economist, Catherine, that you would know, a Canadian one, Armin. I always get her last name wrong. Yalnizyayan. She's talked about it being a she session, and that the impact has been gendered. And when you look at past recessions or even depressions, and I'll laugh because this is sitting beside me. Yes, I am looking back in time to FDR and the New Deal. It's a very different situation right now. And I think there are many reflections about where we've seen vulnerabilities and where we really need to act. And we've seen, in Canada, if you do not have broadband, that's not just a productivity issue. That's whether you can homeschool your kids. That's whether it's an equity issue. It's whether women businesses can survive. And so I think that there are many reflections like that that I've had. And then there's the challenge of actually just, I love my family, but there's a lot of family. So a lot of it is quite chaotic. I've hired my daughter as my intern, and she had really no choice because I still have to do social media. And so she's helping me out, and the kids have been great. But and I think the broader reflection is like, okay, this is terrible. It's really hard, but there's an opportunity here to really reflect on what kind of society we want. And whether it's climate action, which let me tell you, I'm still absolutely committed to climate action, in particular as we think about, if we have to do stimulus, how should we do that? But also, how do we build a more inclusive society? And to your point, Sophie, you talked about what's going on in the US. And I've also had a huge reflection on that. I was talking with my team this morning after having a conversation with our police chief, who's Black, who is really quite inspiring. And he said, the biggest thing you can do, Catherine, is actually make sure you're getting investments into low-income communities, often Black communities, but marginalized communities. And so the social determinants of infrastructure. So you know what? The good news is there's a lot of reflections to be had. It's a hard time, but I think this is the time we really need to be smart about how we move forward and really reflect on what kind of world do we want? What kind of communities do we want?
That's so interesting. And I was looking at that expression also of a he session or a she session. And right now, the face of, particularly in Canada, but elsewhere around the world, it's a different kind of recession that we're facing, in that women are more affected statistically and also have this double burden often of parenting at home and child and schooling. I'm wondering, traditionally, a lot of the infrastructure programs in Canada and around the world have been around bridge building, construction jobs, and they are very male focused in terms of pouring money into the pockets of workers who are men. How do you see, as a Minister of Infrastructure, putting a gender lens on that and acknowledging that this is a different type of recession and that women have been more affected and will need to have money in their pockets, support with their children, and a way to get back to work? Have you started thinking of the gender lens that way?
It's absolutely. It's interesting. When I came to climate, I got quickly into women, and my tagline was "Women Kicking It on Climate," because I was surrounded by amazing women who were pushing the envelope on climate change. It wasn't just that they were women in climate, but they were women leaders like Laurence Tubiana, Christiana Figueres, Rachel Kite, who's a good friend of mine. I could go Mary Robinson, taking climate from a different angle. And I think we need to do that with infrastructure, because you're absolutely right. It is, first of all, it is a different recession. So there's been a big focus, and I think it's right. We do need jobs. We're talking about shovel-worthy projects. But a lot of those jobs, the jobs that have been lost, are female jobs, and they're disproportionately men in the construction sector. I'm part of the Women's Construction Network, so we're going to kick it on construction. But I think that one, who is building things, obviously that's key. But also, and I say this in some ways it's against my interest because I'm the Minister of Infrastructure, it's not just hard infrastructure. Like, I think we need to be thinking, having really big reflections about other issues. Like, we've looked at how challenging the economic situation is for certain groups who weren't traditionally supported through our insurance system and our employment insurance system. People are talking about, should we do guaranteed annual income? Sadly, I'm from Hamilton, and there was a pilot and it was canceled. That I think we need to look at women now. We all know domestic violence is up. Well, we do not have enough shelters for women. Affordable housing. We need to be thinking very seriously about how do we make sure we properly house people, and now layered on that in a safe way, because often they're shared spaces, which they increase the risk. Long-term care facilities, we have more women who are in long-term care facilities. They live longer. They are obviously an area where we have seen the outbreak. So I think that there's a lot of reflections, both in terms of who is building, but also what are we building? And it isn't just hard infrastructure. I think that there are broader reflections about how to really build a more equitable society. That's why I got into politics. I actually wasn't, people often think I was a climate activist. My background, I did trade and competition law. I ran a human rights organization, but I wasn't an expert in that. I wasn't an expert in infrastructure. I'm trying my best to learn. But what I care about is building a better, more equitable, more sustainable, stronger society for Canadians. And I think that's the opportunity, but we have to seize it. And it's another book that I'm looking at, another awesome woman. So Mariana Mazzucato, she makes a really good point. So I've had some time to do some reading, and I think she makes a great point. People often, it's easy to slam governments for not getting things right. Well, guess what? She makes the argument that actually a lot of the innovation and the wealth and the growth that we've seen is due to government. And I think this is the time government needs to show that it can build better public transportation, that it can build better affordable housing, that it can ensure that as we do that, we think about marginalized groups. And that's what I see the opportunity to do, but we're going to have to demonstrate it. And it can't just be talk. It has to be real. That's on climate change, but that's on a whole range of other social issues.
So my question was that I understand that you're on a ministerial team that is looking at an economic recovery plan in Canada to accelerate the green shift here. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about that and what kind of things you're envisioning we can do in Canada, but also one of our viewers has asked to talk about what governments like yours can do to take on climate change in its economic recovery, but also to put the gender lens on that.
So great question. Obviously our government is very, very focused in the immediate economic and health pandemic. So I should say that as a prelude, and that, we're doing some thinking, ministers, a broader group of ministers, but I think there's a lot of reflections to really understand the scale of the situation we're in, which we don't really know because we're only going through the reopening now. But also, where are the areas? And I think, we have to be a bit careful, even understanding the quantum of what we need to do, because we just don't have all the facts yet. So having said that, of course we need, it's funny because there was an article in the paper written by some people I know. They just said, now is not the time to do green infrastructure. I was like, when's the time? What are you talking about? Like, climate change hasn't gone away and the economic opportunity has not gone away. And yes, we have tools like carbon pricing. One of my proudest moments in politics, which just shows just go do hard things. We took a lot of flack for it, but in the end, Canadians supported us for putting a price on pollution. But we still need to take action on climate change. And that hasn't stopped, and that can't stop. And it makes no sense. If we want to be a leader, and I say this for Canada because I'm Canadian, I'm proud Canadian, we need to be out there having the best, cleanest infrastructure. We need to have the clean tech companies. We need to have the innovation. And so to do that, we need to be making these investments. So what are the things we need to be doing? I mean, we're continuing on what we set out as our climate plan. We've committed to net zero by 2050, and we have climate targets. But it's everything from public transportation. I laugh now. My thought was quite hard, and I took a lot of hits. There are a lot of people who, for some reason, gender and climate, that was like epically terrible. There was like, a group within climate, people who were didn't like climate change or were climate deniers. They were also misogynists. So, but the good news is this time round, we have money. Like my portfolio, you can make those investments. So public transportation is key. We have a Canada Infrastructure Bank looking at projects like getting train in the corridor. So we know that we need to have better public transportation. We need to electrify everything, so electric vehicles. We need to retrofit our buildings. We need to make sure we have clean tech companies. I'm really into embedded carbon, so I could really bore you about net zero concrete or low emission concrete. And so I could go on. But as you do that, and as I said, like you also have to not be a one-trick pony. And so it isn't just about climate change. And I say this to my environmental friends, like, yes, it's about climate, but every dollar we spend needs to have multiple outcomes. And that gets to your second point that one of the viewers talked about gender. Of course, that has to be part of that. And that goes back to my earlier reflections, like what kind of recession are we seeing right now? We knew women are being disproportionately impacted, and we know care facilities are being disproportionately impacted. We know women are struggling to school their kids. Women are being abused at home in silence. So I think that there are those broader pieces. We do a gender-based analysis with everything that comes to cabinet. And that has had a massive impact because it makes every single department have to think really, really hard about what they're doing and what are often the unintended consequences. Because we don't always realize that the decisions we have consequences. They can either support women or they can further marginalize women in other groups. It's like climate change. I try to tell people we do a climate lens on our infrastructure projects, and people kind of complain. I said, it's not that hard. You either increase emissions or you reduce emissions. You either increase resilience or you reduce resilience. So we do need to think about those things. And we have to be mindful of taxpayer dollars. And every dollar we spend, I will make sure that it has multiple outcomes. Absolutely economic growth and productivity, but also gender outcomes, equity outcomes, climate outcomes.
And sorry, we're having some technical difficulty with the minister's broadband, which is rather ironic because she was talking about how internet connection is so important right now for people who are, particularly parents who are locked at home and trying to homeschool their children, and the issues of equity around that. And I think she's talking to us from the Capitol, so it shouldn't be a problem there. But while we're waiting for her to join us again, I'm looking through some of your questions that are coming from right across, it seems to be from far away. It's really interesting to hear what you're asking about. Cynthia Chaplin was asking about big infrastructure, that she was talking about. The minister was saying that it's not just about hard infrastructure, but we need to look at soft infrastructure too, in terms of revitalizing the economy once we get it slowly rolling again. And Cynthia's asking if, big infrastructure doesn't include things that are really essential to women and marginalized groups, including transit and healthcare. And of course, I think that's a great question, because here in Canada in particular, our transit systems, like in Toronto where I live, are incredibly under-financed. In fact, they're among the worst financed. Oh, here she is. Hi. She's coming back. So anyway, it's a huge question, and of course, poor people don't own cars and need to take transit to work. So it's a big question in Canada of how continuing funding transit, because traditionally it has not been funded by federal government or provincial government here. The minister is back. Hi, how are you doing?
Oh my gosh, I feel this is very, very stressful.
We were saying the irony of you talking about equity around access to internet. It seems to be happening.
Well, and yes, clearly I need to talk to my provider. Okay.
Well, I was asking you a question before, because you
Sure.
were talking, you broke up a little bit, but you were talking about the misogyny that you faced on that file as the first Minister of Climate Change in Canada, and how it was, for people who are watching from around the world, it was not just online. You had personal attacks. At one point, you needed security during the last election, and it was very gendered, very misogynist about you, but wrapped in climate change, I think. I'm wondering, in this reboot that we're hoping to have in the economy here, and a recreation, as you say, of how we live in our societies, what are you thinking about female political leadership at this time? It's been really interesting to see that many of the leaders of countries that are doing well around the world are women. And in Canada, the voice of public health that has been front and center are almost entirely female. And many of those voices have been empathetic, compassionate, and at times vulnerable, which is normally a death knell for women leadership, to show vulnerability and emotion. I'm wondering what your reflections are going forward, whether we're going to see a more polarized space for women to become leaders and to step into politics, or if there's an opening here and a different kinds of politics that might be available, and might be room for it.
Well, I think probably both. One, I think that there is a longing for empathetic leadership. Go look at Jacinda Ardern. I think everyone around the world is just saying, wow, she is a young mother and prime minister, and she is doing really the best, most incredible job, not just in dealing with COVID, but also reassuring her population. And I'm talking about hard things, like talking about a 4-day work week. So I think there's a longing. I think we need always more women in politics, because there's still misogyny in Parliament. Someone just asked me, couldn't believe it, said, did I know 75, 50%, or 25% of my files?
Oh, wow.
Like, seriously, I'm just like, I don't even get it. But the problem is we're seeing polarization at the same time, which is the worrying thing. And like, just look what's going on in the United States. I mean, there's huge polarization, including in Canada. I think it's overplayed in Canada because now you have voices that are amplified, some columnists, but also some folks on Twitter and social media. But I think there is a real opportunity. And look, I think, you know what happened? I turned 40. I'm much closer I'm almost 50 now. But when I turned 40, I sort of said, you know what, I'm done. I don't really care what people think about me. I'm just going to do what I think is right. And I'm going to be me. And I'm not going to be told what I need to look like and what I need to wear. And people still try to do that with stupid names that they call me. But I'm just going to go and try to do a decent job, which is something I was reading about last night. And that's what's really important in politics. So women are different. Everyone's different. You bring your own background. And the only way, like, authentic is so overused, but it's just about being real and being you. And people can smell a mile away if you're fake. And that is perilous for politicians, but it's also an opportunity. And I can tell you the young kids, not even young, I mean, 30 and under, they're looking for something totally different and they get it. And I think that we owe it to them. And so I think women, it's not just in politics, though, it's in all spheres, need to exert themselves and not fall into the traps that you have to be a particular way, because you also fall into an inauthenticity trap because you're not authentic. You're not who you want to be. And the reality is I have kids. The reality is, like, I have other priorities. I have aging parents. And those are other things, as you said. I mean, when I started my job, I kind of laughed because it's hard to always be home for dinner. But I was so frustrated because my team, who I love, and I loved at the time, they would book me from like 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. if they could. And I was like, gosh, like, I'm becoming actually terrible at my job because I'm so tired. Well, I'm also a terrible mom. And then I just said, forget it. You know what? You got to focus on what's important. And in politics, that's super important. Every day, try to remember what matters. There's the big things, and then there's everything else. Climate is one of the big things. Empowering people whose voices don't have an opportunity to be heard. Equity, social justice. And then everything else is kind of noise. And so I don't know if those reflections help folks. I mean, they kind of help me get through the day. And you do have to be kind of tough, forgiving of yourself sometimes, because I often go home and I'm like, oh gosh, I really screwed up, or maybe I shouldn't have said that. You worry about those things, but you also have to just, there's going to be haters out there, and you know what? They're the minority, I've found, and that most people just want to see that you're working for them and that you've got their interests and you're doing your best. Jean Chrétien once gave me advice. He said, you know what? Canadians are reasonable people. Be reasonable. And that's, just try to be reasonable. Just try to do your best and do it by being yourself.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Jean Chrétien is a former Prime Minister of Canada. And we always think that everyone, you know.
Well, that's true. I'm so Canadian.
We have a great question here from Catarina Santos, and she's asking how Aboriginal communities or Indigenous communities in Canada are dealing with access to internet, which is crucial at this time. I know that's on your file in terms of looking at the North and trying to get, particularly in the North, but what are you seeing? What is, there's not much reporting on that here in Canada. What's happening there?
It is a massive issue. We've committed to having high-speed broadband across the country by 2030. We need to accelerate that. I think COVID has laid bare that it is an equity issue. It is just completely unfair if you can't access the internet. As I say, it's a productivity, it's an equity issue, it's a homeschooling issue. It's now a healthcare issue because we can provide health, a lot of our health services and get people access to a doctor over the internet. But if you don't have access to that, you don't have access to those supports. And I think about young Indigenous kids' mental health issues, right? Like how are we supporting them? We're just excluding them. And so absolutely, I actually think probably the biggest, most important infrastructure investment we could make, which is hard in a very big country like Canada, but is to have high-speed broadband at affordable rates all across the country. And that is something I'm committed to. I'm not the lead minister. I'm working with other ministers on this file, but I think we absolutely have to do that. But gosh, I mean, we need to make sure that Indigenous kids have clean drinking water.
Right.
To make sure Indigenous kids have rec centers so they have facilities. And I've worked very closely from the start of my job with Indigenous leaders. They care a lot about climate change. So we worked well, Inuit, Métis, and First Nations leaders. So, you know, we're going to continue to do that. That's also an equity issue. Gender is important, but there are many other groups that are disadvantaged.
We have about 10 more minutes, and so I'm going to ask some of the questions that are flying in here. So Aaron McGregor, hi, from the Sunshine Coast, which is on the beautiful west coast of the country, is asking how we will ensure green infrastructure projects generate the returns we need them to have as we start to experience the economic impacts of the pandemic? How will we ensure the public continues to support them when their immediate concerns may shift to their own financial challenges? Yeah, how do you convince people that this is still important when they don't have a job and they're hungry and they're worried about the viability of their community just in terms of poverty?
Well, look, that's why I said that, you can't be one trick pony. Like, we all need to just recognize that, yes, we all care about climate change, but people also need jobs. And climate action creates jobs. But I mean, there's also a short-term economic situation. And that's why our government has so many different measures that we've brought in to basically support everyone. I mean, that's what we're trying to do our best during the pandemic, making major changes to programs to ensure that everyone has money. I mean, we people need to be able to survive. We need to be focused on jobs, but you can also do both. So with our infrastructure program, we've had some reflections about, okay, we need jobs. So what are not just shovel-ready projects, but shovel-worthy? What are the things that we could do that are also going to have these multiple dividends? Because there isn't unlimited government money. That's just also a reality. And so, when you think about some of the things that we think you can get great dividends on, it's retrofits of buildings. Because guess what? When you have a more energy efficient building or a home, you save money. So that's a good thing. Natural infrastructure. People are now recognizing that there's a huge value on being able to get to the outdoors when you're trapped in your house. And many people don't have access to that. Many people live in high rises. And so we need to, there's a value on that. But the good thing is, I actually think Canadians, they still care about climate change. Absolutely, they care about putting food on the table, and you can't forget that. But I think if you talk like a real person, which is always a challenge for politicians, but also for environmentalists, like, it's green recovery, yes, but it's actually just building a better future for everyone that's more sustainable, that is stronger, that's more resilient. And I think how we talk about things and how we remember that it's about people's lives, and really talk about how this is going to improve your air quality, how this is going to improve your health, how this is going to make your hopefully your community more resilient so it doesn't flood. Flooding is a massive issue in our country in so many different communities. So I think that there's a huge case to be made. And then look at, in Alberta, they've been slammed by low energy prices. And, there's an opportunity to transition the economy and diversify, which any business person would do. I try to think like a business person. There's a huge risk to not diversifying, especially, in the current situation. So I think there's opportunities there. We talk about a just transition, making sure that everyone has a job. Like, there shouldn't be winners and losers, that, that we all need to do this together, and we have to figure out the jobs piece. Because if you don't figure out the jobs piece, people will not support you on climate change. I don't care what anyone says. People need jobs, and that's everyone needs jobs. They have to have opportunities. And so I think you link the two, but it can't be sometimes in the way we do it in an abstract way, 2030, 2050. That's hard. That is for, that's important from a policy perspective and actually getting the outcomes you want. But you also have to talk to real people about what you're doing. How is it going to affect them? How's it going to affect their kids? How's it going to improve their life? How's it going to ensure that they're going to have a job? How's that going to make better affordable housing? How's it going to mean more nature? How's it going to mean that their communities aren't going to flood? And I think that always remembering that, and I learned that early on as a politician because I'm kind of wonky and I'm a lawyer, so it's like a double, it's really terrible being a lawyer because they teach you to not talk like a real person. If you knock on a lot of doors, which I did, and people are like, what is she talking about? You learn that people care about these same issues, but you got to make it real for them. And I think you can on climate, you can on gender, but you got to be careful not to get into buzzwords and abstract things, just real things for real people.
There's a question from Mill Neopold, and it has to do with businesses. And I'm wondering, like, I know in Canada there was a loan, restart loan for small businesses there was a requirement to report on your climate change impact, basically. And that seems to be kind of a carrot that is being used to win-win at this point. Are you know, what else should companies be doing? But also, what else do you think the government should be doing when it comes to both gender and the climate in this time of reinvesting and trying to restart the economy to prime the pump for businesses and companies to be making these changes themselves? Or
well, I think that's a really good question, because a lot of it is like government solve everything, and I'm well aware of the limits of government. I think government has a huge role to play, regulatory role, incentives, investments, but gosh, in the private sector, the access to capital, access to consumers, to supply chains, they have a massive role to play. And so, look, I actually think that was really important. So when we announced that we would be willing to look at supporting big companies that were struggling, we said, but you will have to show climate action, whether it's climate disclosure or other action. And so, you know, that's one way. I think that, you know, through the decisions we make, whether it's infrastructure investments, I don't know if anyone's in the infrastructure construction feel that they're listening, like it's the same thing. We go through a climate lens and we expect to understand how projects will reduce emissions. And so I think you do that across the board. I think procurement is very important, and we can't forget that. We have a huge amount of money to invest, and we should be looking at who we procure from. But I mean, I also want businesses to just step up, because if you're a business person, so I'm looking at you, if you were a business person right now, the case is clear. The case couldn't be more clear. Like Mark Carney says this, like, you know, you need to figure this out, or we're all going off a cliff, because climate change isn't going away. And the companies that are forward looking, that have CEOs that don't just look only at quarterly earnings. I mean, sometimes if you look at quarterly earnings, you'll get the message too, if you're maybe in the energy sector, but you need to be figuring out what the future is going to look like from a climate angle. As someone said, a businessman that I worked with closely, he said, you got to future-proof your business. And future-proofing your business is figuring out what the future is going to look like. We all, Wayne Gretzky, go where the puck is going, not where it's been. Like that strikes me as something that sometimes is a bit hard, but you know what? Also, your future or your current consumers, the young people, they're going to demand it. And so I think that businesses should be at the table. Of course, we should have incentives, and we have carrots, and maybe you see it as a stick. I see it a little bit as a carrot, because you save money, but a price on pollution that will create incentives. And we have other measures as well. But I think that good businesses know they need to step up and they need to do more.
You know, we've been asking a final question at all of our sessions here, and it's a way of giving you sort of a last moment to reflect on some of these things. But taking account of everything we've just talked about, I'm wondering, you know, do you have final thoughts on what needs to happen to, in the words of Clinton, build back better?
Well, I mean, look, when you just have to take some time and actually think about what outcomes you want. I'm just an outcomes-based person. And so when you design programs, so you make investments, you have to actually just say, okay, it's not just that I built something. It's like, what did I build? Did it reduce emissions? Did it make a community more resilient? Did we build it in somewhere where they don't have any infrastructure? Who's building it? What materials are we using to build it? Who are we supplying from? And people say, okay, that's so bureaucratic. I'm not a bureaucratic person, but gosh, if you're going to spend taxpayer dollars, you better be making sure you're getting double, triple benefit from those dollars. And you can do that in a way that is smart and effective, but it takes some effort. And I think the other thing, it's actually so great being with so many women. I can't see all the women online, but sometimes it can be lonely out there. Like, Yeah, I feel that some days, like, you're out there on your own, you have a great team or gender balanced cabinet, but you're out there on your own in your own portfolio. And I think that also women working with women is so important. That we need to be supporting each other. We need venues like this. We need men to listen to conversations like this. So I hope men are on, because I feel like sometimes we can be an echo chamber, and that is not a good thing. But I think it is important that we all look at how we can support each other, work together. And the last thing is it seems like it's so hard right now. Because I look at what's going on in the US, and I feel exhausted, and I'm not Black. And I look at the what's happening in our Indigenous communities, and it's hard, and I'm not Indigenous. And I think we also need to remember that we are often very privileged few that get to do these things, and that we need to work to diversify even our own networks. And that can be hard. But I remember I ran an organization called the BAM Forum, and people said, well, we just couldn't find a woman panelist. I said, well, you just didn't look, because there are many women out there, all diversity, that are out there waiting to be heard, whose voices need to be heard. So just something I've been thinking about more, because sometimes we think about gender and then we don't think about broader diversity as well. So I think that's really important. So I don't know, maybe a slight reflection in these times. And, I keep on having these conversations, and we're going to get through this, and we are going to build back better. Don't you worry.
Great. Well, thank you for this time. It's been wonderful talking to you
Welcome.
and all of you.
And sorry about the technical difficulties. I don't know, just life.
Thank you so much, Minister McKenna. Thank you so much, Catherine, for this incredibly rich conversation. And it's great to have you back online, Minister. So I really loved your comments at the beginning about getting the full measure of your portfolio as Minister of Communities, as with the pandemic. We were reminded of how critical local communities are, and to our well-being, including nature. So I thought that was a very interesting point. You've also given us such great and personal and political advice. Just to name a few, remember what matters, be forgiving of yourself, don't be one-trick pony, speak like a real person, not like a lawyer. But clearly, you give us a full measure that is such great potential for women, and if women were to take the lead on infrastructure. So I think that's a very important message. One thing I would like to mention on behalf of the Women's Forum, who is hosting this conversation, is last year we launched a climate charter, which is really advocating for mainstreaming gender in every political and business climate decision, and something that we would love your support on, and that we will follow up after this call. But really, I want to thank you wholeheartedly for this conversation. Participant on the other side, I thank you for your contribution, for your question. We had tons of questions coming in. We were not able to cover them all, but Catherine, you picked some of the very good one, I think. If you missed everything, this conversation is recorded and will be available on the website here very soon. Next week, we have conversation with Timnit Gebru at Google, who is heading ethical AI. We'll also be speaking to Chelsea Clinton together with public health professor Devri Sridhar. So please stay tuned and keep looking at what's coming up. We have a few other very exciting conversations coming. So with this, let me close by thanking you all for participating. Thank you, Minister McKenna and Catherine, for your wonderful conversation. Till very soon. Bye-bye. Thanks.